Well, this evening it's my pleasure to introduce John Beaumont. John is not only an author but also a lawyer in Leeds, in England, and he's the author of a book on notable, is it just English or Great Britain more broadly, converts?
Right, the previous book, entitled rather unoriginally Roads to Rome, sorry about that.
This one's a little more creative.
Was published in 2010. I hesitate to say it's about British converts because, as you know, the Scots, or some of them, would like to leave us, so the second edition of the book might be a bit smaller. But that's the essence of it, British and Irish converts.
Right, very nice. And then, so he's going to speak to us today about his current book, Mississippi Flows into the Tiber. And I was flipping through the book, and it says the subtitle is A Guide to Notable American Converts. And I was flipping through the book, and as I recognized some of the names, including my own, I thought really it should be subtitled A Guide to Notorious American Converts. But in any event,
don't take it personally.
Right. Please welcome John.
Well, thank you very much, everybody. I'm grateful to the editor of First Things and First Things Magazine for giving me this privilege speaking to you tonight. Also, my thanks to Peter Jones, of course, and to Fidelity Press. And also a particular vote of thanks from me to Father John McCloskey, who some of you will know. Father McCloskey was asked to write a foreword to the book. He did so. We then sent him the final draft of the book, and he was kind enough to volunteer to write an afterword for the book. And there wasn't a number of dollars put within the pages, I assure you. So before I started tonight, somebody already asked me about my why I wrote the book. I'll say something about that to begin with. I've worked for about 8 years on converts, and this book and the previous one, neither of them would have been written but for the help of a particular individual, and that was Father Stanley Yarkey, who again many people will know of, a great physicist and priest who wrote 50 books and over 500 articles, mainly in the subject of the history of science and the philosophy of science. I was privileged to work with Father Yarkey for 5 years until his death in 2009. So where's the link between himself and converts? There are a number of strands. Father Yarkey was worried at the end of his life because he considered that the church, or rather people in the church, were rather downplaying the process of conversion. He was concerned about that. He saw also the statistics on conversion. If you look at the pontificate of Pius XII, for example, you look at 1939, 65,000 people were received into the church in the United States. 19 years later, in 1958, no fewer than 140,000 converts in that year in the United States. Well, I won't talk about the figures since then because I'm sure you know what the figures are like. And I would say that if you're considering canonizing popes, and 2 have been canonized recently, well, my vote's for Pius XII. For a number of reasons, not least the vibrancy of the church at that time. Father Yarkey saw those figures. He saw the change. He was worried by the emphasis, as he saw it, on subjectivism and relativism. He saw that emphasized by the future Pope Benedict XVI in the speech that he made before the conclave at which he was elected. He saw also, as some of you will have seen, and I've certainly seen, people being told, oh, don't become a Catholic. Remain what you are, a Methodist or a Congregationalist. And he thought that that was completely contrary to Catholic tradition. He also had massive experience in writing about a particular English convert, a very famous one, Blessed John Henry Newman. He wrote something like 8 books on him, including a book entitled Newman to Converts, which tells the story of Newman's relationship with various people who came to see him, perhaps inquiring initially about conversion, many of them becoming Catholics. When Newman converted in 1845, about 3 days before that conversion, he wrote to about 30 people. They were friends and relatives. We still have about 20 of the letters. In all of them, the same sort of phrase is used. He said that he was about to join the true church, the one ark of salvation, the one way of salvation. And this again had an impact on Father Yaki, and he encouraged me to write about these things, and he was emphatic that mere Christianity was not a concept that we should consider seriously, in a sense, although it's used as the title of a book by a very great writer, C.S. Lewis. Hilaire Belloc says that there's no such religion called Christianity. It's always been the church and the various heresies proceeding from a rejection of some of the church's doctrines by persons who still desire to retain the rest of her teaching and morals. But there's never been, he said, and there never can be, a general Christian religion in which there's agreement on central doctrines and an agreement to differ on others. So with that encouragement, I started to do some work on converts, making lists of them and consulting various books. In your country, John O'Brien produced 5 volumes entitled The Roads to Damascus, mostly of notable converts, but not all of them were notable. I'll explain the word notable in a moment. The aim behind all of this changed. And it changed because of my reaction, really, to what is sometimes called the new atheism, this violent attack not only on religion generally, but on Christ and on the Catholic Church. You have 2 particular persons whom I can mention, Daniel Dennett, I think, and Samuel Harris. We have Richard Dawkins, Professor Stephen Hawking, and we share, I suppose, the late Christopher Hitchens, who was born in my country but spent quite a lot of time over here. Well, these writers were extremely antagonistic to religion, and that antagonism still goes on. Then there was the 5th column within the church. I choose only one person, John Cornwell, writer of a notorious book about Pius XII, and recently a writer about the practice of confession, in which he attacks vigorously Pope St. Pius X and refers to the Curie of Ars as a spiritual fascist.
We have Garrett Wills in that category.
I was much too polite to mention that name. Anyway, I saw that perhaps there was a move back in the church under Benedict towards objectivism rather than this subjectivist approach. I also saw that many of the writers who discuss their own conversion give extremely solid reasons for joining the Catholic Church. Those reasons are often out of print, and I found their strength was reinforced by the fact that they are personal accounts. They often arise out of suffering. And I think that's at the very least more readable and gets home to one than the more abstract textbooks do. So I decided that the book ought to make a contribution to apologetics, to a defense of the faith. And that's what the 2 books try to do. Their structure is to refer to the individual, set out their birth, death, and date of conversion and circumstances, give a short summary of their lives, but most importantly, if they'd written about their conversion in a strong and powerful fashion, to quote from those works. And if they were famous, they may well have been criticized by other writers, and I included some extracts from those criticisms. So that's the basis of the book, really. It's not simply a list of converts. How does one get in the book? Well, you have to be, and I put it in quotation marks, notable. But notable now means, in essence, notable from an apologetic point of view, from a point of view of defending the faith. Of course, there are certain obvious inclusions. People who, even if they wrote not a single word about the reason for their conversion, they would still be included. In my country, obviously, Newman, G.K. Chesterton. In your country, St. Elizabeth Seton, St. Kateri Tekakwitha, the Lily of the Mohawks. Orestes Brownson, sometimes said to be the 19th century version over here of Newman. Dorothy Day. Then there are people on the public stage. Generals, dare I say it, politicians, public figures. Some of them wrote about their conversion, not all of them did, and I felt that even though the essence of the book was about apologetics, I couldn't really leave them out. Let me give you an example. Again, I'm going to take it from my own country, because it might be a little bit sensitive over here. Do you remember Tony Blair? That man Tony Blair? When he was in government, he didn't do religion. That was the phrase that went out. After resigning, he did. The Catholic religion, he converted. Father Yaki said to me, this was just before his death, if you include Tony Blair in this book, I will never speak to you again. Did I include him? Of course I did. I had to include him. He'd been received into the church, and in every sense he was a notable figure. Though I did include a reference to his less than effective voting record on the protection of life issues, and some other things as well. What about the others? Well, the other people are people who generally gave a powerful account of their conversion. So to some extent, I think they're the most important people in the book. Some of them we know nothing about, except for their names. Don't even know their date of birth or death, but they are, in that sense, important. How about the living versus the dead? Should I include all of them? Well, it would have been easier to include just the dead, because they can't, as it were, answer back. They can't complain if they're included or if they're not included. Well, not at the moment, anyway, to me. The living, of course, makes it more difficult and controversial as to who to choose. Well, I made a choice based on doing some research of my own and help from friends and colleagues, some of them in the United States. And one of the things about the book is that sometimes the length of the living candidates of the entry is longer than those of those deceased. The reason for that is not because the faith changes, it doesn't, but because different factors can be important at different times. If we think back to the 30s, 40s and 50s, people generally had a reasonably good knowledge of Scripture, at least of the New Testament. Today, frankly, very few people know anything at all about religion and about Christianity. So we're in a different age, and we have to appeal to the strengths of persons writing in that age. I also included reverts, because what I mean by that, of course, people who'd lapsed from the faith came back to it, because very often they gave extremely powerful arguments on that behalf. So why do people convert? Why do people convert in America? They're all shapes and sizes, of course, but I think you'd expect that. Chesterton himself said that the church is a house with 100 gates, and that no two people enter at exactly the same angle. Traditionally, there are 3 steps into the church, or 3 cumulative moves. The existence of God, the divinity of Christ, and then the question of the church. Where is the church? I'll say more about the last one than about the other two, but I'd just like to say a little bit about the first two, very briefly. Question of the existence of God. Well, frankly, I don't think on that one, if you look carefully at the new atheists, that you've very much to worry about. Here's Professor Stephen Hawking. He says that there's no need to invoke God to get the universe going. Why? Because there is the law of gravity. And so he says the universe can and will create itself from nothing. So spontaneous creation is the reason there is something rather than nothing, and the reason why the universe and we exist. No need to invoke God to light the blue touch paper. But hang on a minute. What we've got here is an eminent professor, with respect, using the sleight of hand of a cheap magician. He's trading on his reputation, and he hopes that we won't spot the trick. Because he says the universe can and will create itself from nothing. But just before that, he says it can only do this because there is the law of gravity. A 10-year-old, surely, would come up with the obvious question. Where did the law of gravity come from then? He's not shown that something can come from nothing. He's actually shown the opposite, that there must be the laws of physics first, the law of gravity. I'm reminded of a quotation of perhaps the greatest Englishman, Dr. Johnson. He's talking about Rousseau, and he says this, that a man who talks nonsense like this must know he's talking nonsense. I think that's a significant factor here. Benjamin Franklin said that experience keeps an expensive school, but that fools will learn in no other. So don't worry about the new atheist approach to the existence of God. Just look at the traditional arguments, and they're set out in the book, lengthy extracts from such as Avery Dulles, Father Benedict Ashley, Mortimer Adler, and, in terms of living authors, the philosopher Edward Feser. Surely his book, The Last Superstition, is the definitive refutation of the new atheists. The problem is, of course, certainly in my country, that the supermarkets do stack Richard Dawkins. There are piles of his books. You will not see a copy of Edward Feser or Father Thomas Crean, the Dominican, who also wrote an excellent book in this area. Not at all. The divinity of Christ. What do American converts say about that? What do they find compelling? Well, there are two main themes that they seem to adopt, as far as my researchers have revealed. The first is what we might call the historical approach. The second is what we might call the philosophical approach. Let's look at the history. Here's Joe Sobran debating in print with Christopher Hitchens. This is what he says. It defies belief to suppose that four simple evangelists could have made up the most memorable, influential, and lovable character in human history, besides whom Muhammad is a mere ghost. If it's that easy to do it, let Christopher Hitchens try his hand at the fakery he ascribes to Christians. A few beatitudes and a couple of parables would satisfy me. If the Gospels are packs of lies, then Christianity is the most brilliant hoax of all time. How could a few unlettered individuals invent Christ and then make the story tally with Old Testament prophecy? Pretty powerful stuff, I think, and you will find it throughout the accounts of American converts, and for that matter, converts from my country. The philosophical argument, where does that come from? Well, in fact, a recent article by Paul Brazier in the Heathrop Journal indicates that there's a 2,000-year tradition of this argument. You can find it in the Gospels, you can find it in St. Paul. in the patristic and medieval period, including Thomas Aquinas. But in modern times, the most recent sources of it, the most influential ones, come from two Englishmen, G.K. Chesterton and C.S. Lewis. G.K. Chesterton, well, we English people have to thank you, because it's you who have brought Chesterton back to the status which he ought never to have left, really, whereas my countrymen ignore him. Okay, some of them will know about the Father Brown stories, but the latest version on television of Father Brown, one critic responded by saying that the dramas got one thing right. The leading character was called Father Brown. And that was it. Not an ounce of Catholicity in those dramatizations. Lewis, of course, is intriguing for another reason. If you ask people why they became Catholic, they will usually ascribe it to the influence of perhaps certain writers. Obvious examples are St. Thomas Aquinas, Newman, Chesterton. They're all Catholics. And almost always, it's a Catholic who's the leading influence. Lewis, of course, never became a Catholic. And of course, some people went from Lewis to a belief in the divinity of Christ and then looked at other writers for the existence of the church. Some people just went straight from Lewis to converting to Catholicism. And that's a most unusual phenomenon. I may say a little bit more about him later on. What is this philosophical argument? Well, expressed by Chesterton and Lewis, it goes like this, and expressed by so many American converts, that basically other founders of religion taught doctrines, whereas Christ primarily claimed to be somebody. He claimed to be the way, the truth, and the life. As Lewis puts it, he talked as if he was God. He claimed to forgive sins. He said he had always existed. He said he was coming to judge the world at the end of time. Wow. That's positively awesome. Let's suppose that you were coming to the talk tonight and somebody came up to you in the street and said those things. What would you think? Well, bring the men with the white coats, I think is what you would think. Take this person away. And that's exactly the point that Chesterton and Lewis and devotees of this argument like St. Augustine and Thomas More say. They say, well, the one thing you can't say about this person is that he was a good man, because good men do not make claims of that kind. Sound, solid, ethical teachers do not talk in that way. There's only three reactions: bad, mad, or God. It's the usual way of putting it. But can anyone really believe that the Sermon on the Mount was the discourse of a madman? Of course not. The parable of the prodigal son, sometimes said to be the greatest short story ever recounted. The Lord's Prayer. As Avery Dulles says, who else ever spoke with comparable assurance of the things of God? Joe Sobran challenged the equivalent of the new atheists to invent a saying worthy of Christ. Nobody came up with one because it's impossible. Dorothy Day said that Christ is God, or he's the world's greatest imposter. Flannery O'Connor, not a convert, of course, a cradle Catholic, said, as for Jesus being a realist, if he was not God, then he was no realist, and the crucifixion is an act of justice. Forthright as ever, O'Connor. So that's the approach taken by the great majority of American converts to this issue. Finally, the church. Why enter the Catholic Church? Well, the book, I think, contains the stories of round about 469 individuals. And it's a very long book, obviously, you can see there. I can't deal with all of them. I can deal with certain trends. If I go back to the great English convert, John Henry Newman, we can sketch out the essence of it. Newman was written to by a gentleman who said, well, what do I have to do to become a Catholic? How do I decide? And he said, well, actually, Scripture says, first of all, that Scripture says that we must join the church. And the Creed says that the church is one, holy, Catholic, and apostolic, as we all know. And the fathers of the church, when they were asked by people, well, what if I go into some sort of foreign territory, some strange place? How do I go about finding the right church? And they say, for example, St. Cyril of Jerusalem, well, don't ask for the church, because the heretics claim to have that, but ask for the Catholic Church, and you'll be guided aright. So the main factors, when we come to various converts, there's about 9 or 10 really significant factors. The visibility of the church is a really major one. The word church is used over 100 times in the New Testament, and never in a purely spiritual sense. So, Sheldon Vanauken talks about the fact that the invisible church, he says, was never heard of until the 16th century, until the Reformation. Several converts emphasized the concrete, visible institution that is the church, that actually embodied unity as early as the apostolic age. Carl Olson talks about how God works through physical things, visible things, the incarnation, the church. And then there's universality, or what we term Catholicity, the Catholic element of the church. The great American historian Carlton Hayes criticized European nationalism, and he put it down to the breakdown of Catholic internationalism. Hayward Brown said that when he became a Catholic, he felt at home everywhere. And Jeffrey Steenson talks about his joy at belonging to a really big family. Edward Dodson talked about the rich and the poor next to each other in the congregation at the communion rail. What a democracy, he said. That's real democracy. And it's emphasized also by Dorothy Day. So it's people of all different ages, all different colours who are emphasized. Then there's continuity. We have an unbroken church, right the way from the apostles to us. The early fathers are just as Catholic as later theologians. We have the great line of the papacy. The church then does develop, as Newman explained, but it essentially remains the same. This was a significant factor. So Peter Kreeft talks about the same old seaworthy ship, Noah's Ark, that Jesus commissioned. The whole ark still sailing unscathed, he says, on the seas of history. Avery Dulles talks about the fact that through all the ages, the treasure of faith has been preserved intact. But notice something about this. It's not just continuity, which implies endurance. It's continuity and endurance in the most astonishing circumstances. Why? Because of the terrible things that go on in the church, or committed by people supposedly associated with the church. And many of these writers go into some detail about this. These bad things, well, I don't need to tell you about them. Obviously, in recent years, the sexual abuse crisis. But much earlier, these bad things were still happening. There have been many very great popes, but there have been some who have behaved in pretty appalling ways. I'm not going to mention the Borgia Pope. I think that's overdone, in fact. Let's deal with Stephen VI. He reigned from 896 to 897, not the best of times for the church. Well, Stephen VI exhumed his predecessor, Formosus, and had his rotting remains put on trial. To be fair, he gave him the right to counsel, to argue on his behalf, because it was difficult for him to argue for himself, obviously. The trial ended in a conviction for all sorts of offences. What did they do? Well, they cut off 3 fingers of his right hand, his blessing fingers, of course, and then they threw him in the Tiber. Stripped him of his vestments first, of course, tossed him in the Tiber. Not good, is it, really? Not very good. Stephen VI, what happened to him? Well, the next year he was strangled to death. So he didn't come to a happy end either. Benedict IX sold his office to his successor and led such a notorious lifestyle that one saint called him a demon from hell in the disguise of a priest. Then there's the sack of Constantinople in 1204, with hundreds of murders and rapes by supposed crusaders. As Flannery O'Connor said, sometimes you have to suffer as much from the church as for it. Well, many people don't become Catholics because of the things that they've heard about what's gone on. In reality, these things don't discredit the church, as so many of these converts are astute enough to point out. They actually prove the church. So let's take an example. Julian Green. Julian Green's rather unusual phenomenon because he was an American citizen, but he spent almost all his life in France, and he wrote almost entirely in French. But when the French government tried to give him honors, he refused them. He didn't want them. He was an American citizen. Here's what he said. It's good, solid sense. It's not the saints that one has to talk about if one is to prove the sanctity of the church. It's bad priests and popes. A church governed by saints continues on. That's normal and human. But a church that can be governed by villains and imbeciles and still continue, that's neither normal nor human. There are many stories of this kind, some no doubt apocryphal, but they all go back to the same theme. Several of them are found in the book. Here's another outside of the book. Napoleon is supposed to have said to Cardinal Consalvi, "Don't you realize that if I wished, I could destroy the church?" Consalvi replied, "Your Majesty, even we clerics have not managed that in nearly 2,000 years. So there we are. Walker Percy was asked, isn't the Catholic Church in a mess these days? Badly split, its liturgy barbarized, vocations declining? He said, sure. That's a sign of its divine origins, that it survives these periodic disasters. Belloc remarked truly that the church must be in God's hands, because seeing the people who have run it, it couldn't possibly have gone on existing if there wasn't some help from above. Okay. The question of authority is a significant one. The claim to be protected from error, for example. Christopher Huntington was very impressed by Cardinal Faulhaber of Cologne when he attacked the beliefs of the Nazis. He saw that the true church could not act in any other way than the good cardinal had. Scott Hahn asked the question, well, how many churches have applied for the job of being the pillar and foundation of truth, the definition of the church? I know of only one, the Catholic Church. And that's been around for 2,000 years. Beauty is another factor which is brought out by many of these writers. Some saw the faith as not only true, but in the words of Thomas Stork, as compellingly attractive and beautiful. Many were attracted by medieval architecture, by Gregorian chant, by the philosophy of St. Thomas Aquinas, and by illuminated manuscripts. Justine Ward, grossly neglected, was a great writer on Gregorian chant. She lived from 1879 to 1975. She was pretty disappointed at the time of her death because chant had well nigh disappeared at that point in time, making a recovery, thankfully. Father Zulsdorf, the blogger, convert of course, talked about the church as giving us a twofold legacy of beauty. Not only the saints, but the arts. The Mass. Peter Burnett, the first American governor of California, attended a midnight Mass and said he'd never seen anything like it before. He was so moved by it. Daniel Sargent came to appreciate that the Mass is a sacrifice. It's God's own sacrifice. The real presence, the reverence of Catholics, that Mass and benediction has often set other people thinking. And several of these converts read the early fathers, and some of them were shocked to discover that they attacked the heretics, even at that early date, for not admitting that the Eucharist was the flesh of our Lord Jesus Christ. And just the mere witness of people regularly going to Mass, friends of people, they went to Mass every day, made an impression on a potential convert. The Blessed Virgin Mary, many have acknowledged that cries for help to her assisted their conversion, including notably Saint Elizabeth Seton. The saints, living examples of holiness. Daniel Sargent, again, was mightily impressed by the work and the behavior of French priests in the First World War, under fire, bringing sacraments to mortally wounded individuals. And even visits to shrines converted, well, Francis Parkinson Keys and Fulton Ursula, a partial contribution. Moral teaching. More and more in recent years, converts have seen the Church as a sign of contradiction and as opposing the main plank of secular humanism, namely sexual liberation. Many have entered the Church because of her stance on abortion. Elizabeth Fox Genovese moved from an extreme left-wing feminist position to a Catholic position primarily because of this. Jennifer Ferrara, Jason Jones, the film director, Bernard Nathanson, the notorious abortionist, Nellie Gray from the March for Life, the actress Patricia Neal, who had an affair with another actor very early on in her career, and this was a source of trauma for her for many, many years, until she finally recovered, partly due to the influence, primarily due to the influence of Mother Dolores Hart. And for her, she was in 2 films with Elvis, I think, and Montgomery Clift and Robert Wagner, and then, of course, went into the convent and is now a prioress. And finally, on these sort of life issues, Norma McCorvey. Know who she is? She's Jane Roe, of course. Jane Roe of Roe and Wade, working later on in relation to life issues. And then finally, in a perhaps a less serious context, deathbed converts. Well, there are examples, aren't there, in fiction, examples in real life as well. Have you ever heard of anybody who, in their last throes, shouted out, "Get me a minister of the United Reformed Church"? Just doesn't happen, does it? Sorry to any United Reform members who might be here tonight. Yeah, okay. It's get me a Catholic priest, isn't it? I think that's significant. And in fiction, of course, remember Lord Marchmain and Brideshead Revisited? Taken from a real live example that War did act in a very virtuous way to assist a friend of his, Herbert Duggan, who in fact had lapsed from the faith to come back from the faith. So that scene has a degree of realism about it, because it comes from real life. Moving on then finally to a conclusion. What the book is, as you'll have, as I've implied really, is it's really a grand parade of American history and takes into account the apologetic context. So from the American Revolution we have Thomas Sim Lee, governor of Maryland later on. From the Civil War we have many eminent soldiers, perhaps most famously the Confederate General James Longstreet. We meet up with the defender at the Alamo, Jim Bowie, who didn't invent the Bowie knife. It was invented by his brother, I believe, who is also a convert. And then there's Kit Carson, and on the other side there's Chief Black Elk, and on the other side again there's Buffalo Bill, a deathbed convert. From the law, there's Sherman Minton, who was a Supreme Court justice who ruled against racial segregation. And there's also Robert Bork, who didn't get the chance to rule against anything because his nomination didn't go through for disgraceful reasons, I think. There's the spy, Elizabeth Bentley. There's the communist activist at one time, Bella Dodd. There's the radical communist journalist, Louis Boudens. The last three all have the same link, and the link is Archbishop Fulton Sheen, a major source of conversion in this country. Then there are the literary figures. Wallace Stevens, the poet, a deathbed convert. Walker Percy, particularly close to me in the sense of how I appreciate his writings, his analysis of the dislocation of man today and the limits of science. There's Robert Lowell, the poet. Well, sort of. I don't mean sort of poet, I mean sort of convert. Lowell was an Episcopalian who became a Catholic in 1941. In 1944, he went back to the Episcopal Church, but in 1949, he became a Catholic again. But, sorry, in 1955, he went back to the Episcopal Church, where he died.
We have cafeteria Catholicism. That must be revolving door Catholicism.
Yeah, that is. There is actually a person in my country, Robert Hawker, who I think achieved a higher number of conversions than Lowell. And he actually did become a Catholic, I think this was the 6th conversion on his deathbed, dear me. And then most controversial of all, to some people, is Ernest Hemingway. Now, many people consider Hemingway as just a nominal and even a bogus Catholic, and the great majority of books do say that. His friend A. Hotchner is much more, I think, accurate in bringing out more of his Catholic life. Okay, there are the problems, aren't there? The marriages, his death, of course, by suicide. Clearly that did run in the family, and he had been subjected to medical treatment, which would be today found to be grossly improper. But H.R. Stoneback in New York in recent years has written several articles and some books bringing out far more the Catholic element of Hemingway. And it's quite significant, in fact, quite profound. He, of course, presented his medal for the Nobel Prize for Literature to Our Lady of Pilar. And there are many other examples of the Catholicity, if you like, of his life. I've tried to indicate those by substantial extracts from the various articles. And science, we mustn't leave out science because, as you know, the tradition is to say that the Catholic Church is dead set against science, when of course it's the opposite, as Father Yarkey managed to show in many of his books. Gertie Corey, a Nobel Prize winner, was the first female American prize winner for science. John von Neumann, the mathematician and logician, father of the computer in some ways, and said by some people to be in part the model for Dr. Strangelove in the Kubrick film. Another model is Sylvanus Morley, the archaeologist. Who's he the model for? Well, it's said to be Indiana Jones. I don't know. Karl Landsteiner, one of the most significant figures in the science of immunology. And Edward Lee Green, the great botanist, all converts to the Catholic Church. So it's a galaxy of individuals. Finally, from the sublime to the ridiculous. The sublime, sanctity. St. Elizabeth Seton, founder of a new religious order, the first native-born citizen of the United States to be canonized. And I'm sure you know more about her life than I do, because, well, you're Americans and I'm not. To the ridiculous. Well, sort of. Arthur Simon Flegenheimer. Anybody know him? Arthur Simon Flegenheimer. Okay. Born in the Bronx in 1901. His father abandoned the family very early on. He got involved in crime, and this comes into the Prohibition period. So it's bringing liquor in from Canada. He became very rich. Later on, it's the numbers racket, extortion, killing your rivals, as people did. His longtime opponent was Thomas Dewey, the politician. Finally, Arthur was shot by hitmen at the Palace Chop House in Newark, New Jersey. He lingered on for some hours. He asked for a Catholic priest who came and baptized him and gave him the last rites, Father Cornelius McInerney. And then Arthur died later on the same day, and was buried, of course, in consecrated ground, buried in the Gate of Heaven Cemetery, Westchester County, New York. Right. There was absolute outrage. This is Dutch Schultz. And all of the entrants in the book have an indication of what they did in their lives. So it will give a name and it will say priest, educator, actress, musician, mobster. Well, some good priests wrote letters indicating that there was an argument for the church in this respect. They emphasize a number of factors. First of all, that only one person, God, can judge a whole life. That's clearly a significant matter. And that there's no crime that can't be forgiven if the sinner is truly contrite. Don't forget, said one priest, the role of grace. After all, he didn't die immediately. He was given the chance. So let's think about ourselves, not about Dutch Schultz and people like that, because not everybody is given that chance. And then, of course, there's the example of our Lord and his dialogue with the penitent thief, traditionally known as Dismas. So, yeah, I think that the Catholic Church's position over Dutch Schultz can be defended. And one thing that his case does bring to light is an additional factor. He had a good Catholic wife who had been praying for him for many years. And who knows what the effect of those prayers were. And often it's the case, isn't it, that it's not reasoned arguments always, but it's the witness, the good behavior of other people with whom you come into contact that makes for conversion. So the book is not concerned with politics in any way, shape or form. It's not concerned, and I would deplore, becoming a Catholic as a sort of add-on, just an add-on to being an American. What the characters in the book are emphasizing is the need for a real conversion. And that can only be based on the truth. Thank you very much.